So today, Amnesty is launching a report titled No Food, No Water, No Animals, the human rights impact of drought and displacement in Somalia. The report examines how the 2020 to 2023 drought impacted people in southern Somalia, particularly its impact on the right to food, right to water, right to health, right to livelihood, and right to life. The report documents both the experiences of people in displacement camps inside Somalia as well as across the border into Kenya. And maybe I may add that a lot of the people who've ended up in Kenya in IDP camp, in the refugee camp in Dadaab, were originally displaced in IDP camps in Somalia. So the failure by the Somalia government to provide adequate services to the displaced persons inside Somalia translated to those people moving across the border into Kenya. So the report documents these experiences, including the journey from southern Somalia into Kenya. The report also highlights how inadequate climate finance by high-polluting, high-income countries has made it difficult for countries, poor countries like Somalia, to fund adaptation, particularly provision of social services. And therefore, the humanitarian actors operating in South Somalia, who are operating under tough situations because on one hand there is conflict and on one hand there is drought and drought, continue to suffer inadequate financing and therefore unable to assist the Somalia government fulfill its obligations under domestic and international law as regards provision of water, food, and health services. We at Amnesty believe Somalia failed because despite there being a conflict and despite there being economic hardship, international law establishes minimum core obligations of all countries as regards provision of health, food, water, and livelihood. So if we look at the deterioration of these services, which then led to whole villages moving out of Somalia into Dadaab, we believe that Somalia did not fulfill its obligation. The other thing is that international law obligates countries to allocate enough finances for human rights. That is, enough finances for health, enough finances for water, enough finances for food. Now, we note that when we do an analysis of the Somalia budget, we notice that Somalia did not allocate enough budget to deal with these challenges. So in this regard, we believe the country failed to comply with its domestic and international obligations. But Somalia is not alone in this, because international actors are obligated, especially under the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, to provide adequate climate financing, because they are responsible for this particular issue of climate change. So they should provide adequate climate financing to help countries like Somalia adapt to climate change. So as much as they keep speaking in COP and in other forums about their commitments, these commitments have not translated into money that countries like Somalia need to respond to drought. Somalia is one of the most affected countries, and Somalia has faced, on one hand, hurricanes along the coast. It has also faced drought interspersed with floods. So you then have erratic rainfall resulting into drought or lack of rainfall at all. And then when the rains come, there is too much of it, then translating into floods. Both of these end up displacing populations. And especially in southern Somalia, where there is a history of marginalization, this mixes up with this history of marginalization to worsen the situation of people, and therefore cause the suffering that we've seen and violations related to food, water, education, and health. As world leaders start meeting in Brazil today, we want to see renewed commitment to climate finance. And not just political commitments. We want to see those commitments translated into actual funds for climate adaptation. Because as we speak, people continue getting displaced by drought, people continue getting displaced by floods and hurricanes and so on across the global south, including Somalia. Much as we have established the Fund for Loss and Damage at the international level, there is only limited contribution that has been realized. And we want renewed commitment in terms of renewed transmission of more funds from the high polluting countries into that particular fund. And we also believe that the fund should start disbursing to countries like Somalia, because as we continue to wait, more and more people continue getting sick, more and more people continue getting displaced, more and more people continue dying. So on one hand, we must get more money into the fund, but two, we must also fast track the process of disbursing the money to the most affected countries like Somalia. Climate change-induced displacement is one of the main challenges that the continent faces. And it interacts with a history of political marginalization and a history of debt to make the situation of many communities in Africa really bad. Because countries are using resources that would otherwise be used to provide social services to respond to climate shocks. So respond to drought, respond to floods, but this is inadequate because they use a lot of their money. Most countries in Africa use up to 50–60% of their resources to fund debt servicing. So this money, if we get debt waivers, then we'll be able to use this money to fund climate adaptation. But this still wouldn't be adequate anyway, and that is why we make calls for increased climate finance.